Thank you, Bryce. Welcome, everybody, to this Sunday morning service here at Salt and Light Christian Church. The story I have for you all this morning, I thought it was appropriate to cover a couple of the more miraculous stories of our country's founding, seeing as how we have just celebrated the 250th birthday of our blessed nation. And so, at this time, the story I have for you is about George Washington. Before he was a general leading the Continental Army, he served for the British Army as a militia member in the French and Indian War. And he led the Virginia militia in this war in the beginning of it. However, after his catastrophic failure at Fort Necessity, George Washington had to surrender to the French, and he lost several of his men in this battle. However, this was a pivotal moment in his life that changed him. He truly learned the importance of warfare and the cost that it brings, the importance of saving his own men and their lives over the outcome of the battle. And so later on in this same war, after he was demoted, he went back and volunteered to serve with the militia. And he told these men that he had once led that when the fighting started, he would be there with them in the front lines. And despite getting sick with dysentery, when the fighting broke out along the British column, the army, the column as the army was moving through the wilderness, fighting broke out with the French at the head of the column. And George Washington was awoken. He was sick, so he was near the back in the safer part of the army. However, as soon as he found out what was going on, he jumped up onto his horse and rode up the column to the front where his fellow Virginians, the militiamen, were stationed. And as he rode his horse up the column through heavy gunfire from all directions as the French had surrounded the British, he finally made it to the front of the column, and he found his fellow Virginia militia soldiers that were surrounded by the French and bunkered down in this little pit. And he got there, and as soon as he got there, he began giving orders and commands, and he raised their morale, and he changed the tide of that battle, despite the British who were already on the retreat, even though no retreat order had been given. And so that day, George Washington, despite having no formal rank or title, saved many of his fellow Virginian militia soldiers. After that battle, when he was giving his report, his commanding officer noted that he had several bullet holes all throughout his jacket and even one in his hat. Notably, one bullet hole right over his heart, where his heart should have been. And his officer was baffled how George Washington was still alive. Not only did this baffle his commanding officers, but it baffled his enemies as well. Later on, one of the Indian chiefs that was fighting with the French in that battle had personally shot George Washington 17 times. And he knew that he hit him, that he didn't miss, not all 17. However, George Washington continued to fight, continued to ride his horse, and didn't fall. And so this Indian chief needed to meet this man, and through connections with the other Indians, he ended up having a meeting with George Washington, where he told George Washington of a legend that his people had of a great protector spirit that was over George Washington. We obviously, with hindsight and the Bible, know who that spirit was that protected him. And so this The French and Indian War played a huge part in forming the man that would become General George Washington, leading the Continental Army for the United States. Many decades later, as he was general, leading the Continental Army through arguably their darkest period at Valley Forge, while they were struggling in the winter, men were starving and having to drudge through the snow with bare feet because they were eating the leather boots that they had. One night, George Washington went missing. He left the camp all by himself, hopped on his horse, and went riding out into the wilderness. And he rode out into the snow, and he got off his horse and got on his knees in the snow to pray all alone. And he prayed so fervently, his soldiers wondered where he went. One soldier went looking for him and ended up finding him. And when he saw the picture of his general kneeling in the snow, in the darkness by his horse, we have a picture in the other building hung up in remembrance of this moment. When he saw his general in this position, he couldn't interrupt him. The soldier left and went back to the army and reported what was going on. And so the soldiers began to follow suit, and they began to pray as well. And it wasn't more than a week or so later that there was an unusual warmth. A warm front came through and melted a bend in the river that they were camping near. And many of the fish in this river confused this warm front for being spring, and they began rapidly, the eggs began hatching in the river that would normally stay dormant over the winter. And this one bend in the river that thawed out became full of hundreds of fish right near their camp. And the soldiers were able to collect this fish and have plenty of food to get through the winter and even into the spring. These are just two examples of how our God mightily worked his will through the founding of this nation. There are many others if you go looking for them. But I wanted to share these with you today to remind us how this nation was formed and by who this nation was formed, and that his hand is still on our nation today, continuing to form it and lead it. So thank you. Let's bring the music up.